Hello and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, Executive Editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me today is Casey Harper, the Center Square's Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief. We are recording this on Friday, July 21st. Casey, Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was before Congress this week testifying about government censorship of Americans, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. What did Kennedy have to say?
Yeah, this was a really interesting hearing this week. Kennedy appearing before lawmakers, especially he's risen in popularity and notoriety, though among Democratic primary voters, he's still trailing Biden by, you could guess 40 or you could say 50 based on the polling done last month, 50 somewhere in that neighborhood points behind Biden. So it's seeming pretty doubtful right now that Kennedy is going to be able to catch up on Biden because of how they're not even going to have debates, and the Democrats aren't even going to have debates to give him a chance. So that's going to be tough for him unless these investigations we've been talking about and writing about at the centersquare.com really ramp up to a point where Biden is in a lot of trouble. Then RFK maybe could slide in, but at that point you might see other people like Gavin Newsom come forward. All I have to say, that's who this RFK guy is, or junior guy is. For those who don't know, he's challenging Biden, and he really became especially popular during COVID because he was very skeptical of the COVID mandates, COVID, vaccines and masks. And as a public Democrat, being outspoken about those things, he kind of got a lot of attention because that was very much in the face of what Democrats were doing at the time. And what he testified this week at the hearing about was really the backlash and the censorship that he experienced this week, or during that time, during COVID from his positions, right? So, of course, we've talked a lot on this podcast about, for example, how, federal law enforcement pressured social media companies to censor things around, COVID policies, around the Hunter Biden laptop story. And what was really interesting, and I didn't know very much about before this hearing, but RFK Jr. pointed to something called the Trusted News Initiative. So this is his quote: "The TNI is a news censorship cartel whose members include the BBC, the Washington Post, Associated Press, Reuters, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. Whenever non-mainstream online news publishers report facts or viewpoints deemed by the TNI to be, quote, misinformation, TNI members censor, shadow ban, or deplatform those publishers. This so-called misinformation has frequently included wholly legitimate, accurate reporting, for example, that COVID might have originated in a virology lab in Wuhan, or that the COVID vaccine did not prevent infection or transmission." So I would love to get your reaction to that, but we've heard a lot about government censorship, but this is so interesting, seeing these major media companies and major tech companies colluding together to decide what's true, what's not, and not always getting it right.
Well, it's been well documented now that just to take one portion of that statement, it's well documented now that the COVID vaccines do not prevent infection or transmission.
Right.
But when the vaccines were first revealed or first put to market, and then for months and months and months afterwards, that kind of information was suppressed by mainstream media, social media giants like Facebook and Twitter. I remember more than a year into the vaccines being out there, President Biden and others were saying this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated, when it turns out that none of that was true. I guess it's a little bit refreshing to hear a Democrat say this very publicly, but of course he's being vilified. Democrats in Congress tried to censor him before his appearance before Congress this week.
Yeah, they did. And then when he came before the hearing, they just absolutely blasted him and called him a racist and interrogated him and tried to discredit him in every way possible. But this has real life consequences. I mean, I've been amazed. I don't know if you've really been following the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, but about 19 million people in the U.S. got the J&J vaccine, right? And we're basically told that if they didn't get it, they could die, right? Or maybe not die, but give, COVID to their grandmother because they weren't vaccinated, and then she would die. So they were really pressured into this. And now that vaccine is no longer available. And like it's been revoked, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure, didn't they remove the FDA approval for the J&J vaccine. I know it's definitely no longer available. So it's like, wow, how can 20 million people get rushed a vaccine, and then they are forced and told by all the information power centers that they have to get it, and now it no longer be available. And now, of course, we know about the almost immediate side effects of the J&J vaccine for women, for example, the clotting and things like that. So, I mean, there's just an erosion of trust. And when people hear something like, we're just in a totally different world, Dan, where you can say something like, yeah, WAPO, BBC, AP, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft are colluding to censor people. The average American's like, oh, yeah, I mean, probably. It's not surprising. Of course, that's what's happening. And that's kind of my experience. A lot of people, not just famous people like RFK Jr., have had their posts about COVID either, flagged or taken down, or they've been shadow banned. So this has become, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how we get to a place where censorship isn't the norm. I think, I would like to believe that what we're doing, Dan, with, independent podcasts like this, writing at thecentersquare.com, where people can, find what we try to make objective reporting, digging into the facts, and uncensored, whether we, personally like the outcome or not. Maybe that is the solution, but it's hard to get your voice through and break through when people who control how people even Google things, are against you.
Yeah. And when the federal government is colluding with these major media outlets, social media outlets, influencing them, persuading them to remove information that now turns out to be accurate, that is government censorship. That is a violation of Americans' First Amendment rights. What's being done about that?
The one thing that's been a big game changer recently is a court injunction against the federal government. That was, Missouri v. Biden earlier this month. The judge ruled in this injunction that White House and the FBI must stop pressuring social media companies to censor conservative speech, pointing to the First Amendment. So if this could somehow get up, to the Supreme Court, and we could get some kind of more broad ruling about the First Amendment, I think that's what's needed, because there's a lot of a lack of clarity around how the First Amendment applies to a digital world, right? Because you might say you have free speech on Facebook, but Facebook is a private company that owns everything that you're even looking at on the computer when you're on that site, right? So do you really have free speech in someone else's home or someone else's company? But at what point does Facebook get so large that they're more like a public utility? These are kind of the questions that have been debated, and people go back and forth on, but we don't have really an established decisive thing about at what point is a private company or the government violating the First Amendment on the internet, because that's where this whole battle is on the internet. And this court ruling is, of course, more on in conservatives' favor, but this is the kind of thing that has to get worked out, and maybe the Supreme Court will address it. We'll just have to see.
And let me be clear, but we do have to close. Private companies, they own their sites. Meta owns Facebook. Facebook can do, generally speaking, not absolutely, but Facebook can do what it wants with its site. But when government gets involved to influence a Facebook, that's when it's censorship and First Amendment violations. But Casey, we are out of time. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Casey Harper, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.